If it's Wednesday, reaction and reckoning. A win for Democrats in Georgia's Senate runoff secures the party's grip on Senate control as Republicans grapple with the former president's role in the party as he enters a tailspin of legal and electoral setbacks. Plus, the Supreme Court hears arguments in a high-stakes case that could reshape election laws in battlegrounds across America, just in time for the 2024 election season. We'll find out if the justices tip their hands on how they might rule. And 3,000 police officers, 130 raids, and 25 arrests. How German officials thwarted a terrorist group's plot to overthrow the government there, and what it means for far-right extremism at home and abroad. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake. What happened in Georgia last night has the potential to reverberate through American politics for weeks and months to come, from the halls of Congress and the White House to the gold-trimmed halls at Mar-a-Lago. Republicans were dealt one final election night defeat in this 2022 midterm cycle as incumbent Georgia Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock held on to his seat by just about 3 points in his runoff against Republican Herschel Walker. Warnock's success in a key battleground state like Georgia has also instantly vaulted him into the mix for potential contenders to lead the party after Joe Biden. Here is some of what he told supporters in his victory speech last night.
I am Georgia. I am an example and an iteration of its history, of its pain and its promise, of the brutality and the possibility. But because this is America, and because we always have a path to make our country greater against unspeakable odds, here we stand together. Thank you, Georgia.
As I noted, there's going to be a lot of fallout from this result in both parties. In the short term, first and foremost, Warnock's victory gives Democrats 51 Senate seats, which increases their power in the chamber and gives them some much-needed breathing room on tight votes. In short, they can now afford to occasionally lose Joe Manchin. In the medium term for Democrats, the extra seat gives them some much-needed cushion heading into 2024's brutal Senate map. And long-term, for 2024 and beyond, they may have found a potential star in Raphael Warnock, whose back-to-back victories in battleground runoffs could even prime him for a White House run someday. As for Republicans, the loss has only exacerbated the party's internal struggles following its lackluster midterm performance, as voters once again rejected another flawed Trump-backed candidate. The rest of the statewide slate in Georgia, including Trump antagonists Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, swept their races, in many cases easily. Not Walker. Look, there's no sugarcoating it for Republicans. Mr. Trump's fingerprints were all over this defeat, just like they were on others this cycle. And as a result, a few more fingers are starting to point in his direction.
This obsession with the 2020 election became an albatross and a real liability for people who are running, especially in swing states.
I think we lost 2 or 3 or 4 races we didn't have to lose this year.
What you can say objectively is that those candidates most closely associated with former President Trump underperformed. That is objective.
I think he's less relevant all the time. Again, even if you capture all of the Trump voters, you may be able to win a primary, but you're not necessarily going to win a general election. And in this business, you have to win an election before you can actually govern.
Folks, it has been a shambolic 22 days since Donald Trump launched his latest presidential campaign, with everything from outlandish statements about the Constitution to unsettling embraces of bigots. Up until now, Republicans have consistently demonstrated a brazen willingness to overlook his behavior. But after last night and after this election cycle, he risks being branded by some in his party as probably the worst thing a Republican can be by his own admission, a loser. Joining me now to talk about all this, NBC's Shaq Brewster, who was at Warnock headquarters last night. He joins us from Atlanta. And also with us is Atlanta Journal-Constitution Washington correspondent Tia Mitchell. NBC's Mark Caputo has been following all things Trump since his announcement last month. And my NBC News colleague Ryan Nobles is with us on Capitol Hill. So, Shaq, how did Raphael Warnock pull this off, and what did you see last night at that campaign party?
Well, you have two different dynamics here. You know, on one end, you look at the numbers. When you look at the county numbers and the county results, you see that Warnock, especially in this Atlanta metro area, he was able to squeeze more Democratic vote, especially in those counties that were historically Republican. Those shifts that we've been seeing over the past 10, 15, 20 years only continued to get worse for Republicans, and Warnock really took advantage of that. But you also saw evidence when talking with voters, both voters who supported Warnock and those who voted for Walker. You saw evidence that that closing message that you heard from the senator, that Herschel Walker did not have the competence or the competency, or it was competency or the character to serve as Senate. You heard voters saying that they believed the same thing. Even those who voted for Walker said that they second-guessed it or hesitated before casting that ballot, pointing to the allegations against him of misconduct, the allegations that really dominated much of the runoff and the general election. So those factors all combined into what you saw last night, which was, yes, still just about a 3% win for Raphael Warnock, but here in the state of Georgia, that is historically significant, and you have Democrats saying they not only feel that they got a victory, but they feel they overcame a lot of the efforts to suppress votes in this state. So they see it as a victory on multiple fronts. And that's what they were celebrating last night at that party in downtown Atlanta, where it was a raucous event, a lot of celebrations happening. It was a big win for folks, for Democrats specifically.
We talk about campaign victory parties all the time, but that Warnock event looked like it actually really fit the bill. Shaq,
it was different.
Yeah, you talk about turnout here. Obviously, that's always key. But in this case, I mean, Walker clearly failed to hit his numbers. Warnock actually improved on his margins in a lot of places. What are you hearing from voters, both today and leading up to this, about why they went to the polls for yet another runoff election here, where the fate of the Senate wasn't at stake?
Well, one thing is that they're getting used to this. They're used to the process of going to the polls on election day in November, then having to come back out for a result that people say is more significant or where there are high stakes. They did this in 2020 and then came back out in 2021 when the balance of the Senate, control of the Senate, was on the line. But on both sides, people said this time around, although they knew it wasn't about who was going to control the Senate chamber, that this result was not going to determine whether or not Democrats or Republicans would have ultimate control, they still understood the implications of this seat. They knew that there would be an easier path for Democrats on things like nominations, on different pieces of legislation, if they got this seat. And I'll tell you, especially here in Atlanta, where we know Raphael Warnock has that deep history. He's a pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. There's a deep affection for him. People like this man. They wanted to have his back. You heard that sentiment. I wanted to go to the polls. I was going to stand in line in early voting, despite it being a shorter runoff period. I was going to do that because I wanted to show support for Senator Warnock. That is what drove a lot of people to the polls. And there's a question over whether or not that passion was there on the other side, especially when you look at those county maps and the shift in vote from the general election to the runoff election, Garrett.
It's not rocket science, but sometimes the parties forget this. If you run likable people, folks want to go vote for them. I can make big bucks as a political consultant. Tia, Shaq teed this up here a little bit, talking about some of the similarities, some of the differences in this runoff from what we saw in 2021. But what did you see as the big differences here from that last, kind of nation-grabbing runoff election that we saw in early 2021 in Georgia?
Well, some of the difference were just by mechanics of that runoff window being condensed. So the fewer days for early voting. A big difference was after they condensed the runoff window, fewer days of early voting, but then that lawsuit over whether early voting would be available the Saturday after Thanksgiving, that did two things. Number one, it enraged Democrats. It really fired up their base, made them even more intent on participating in the runoff, but it also furthermore helped Raphael Warnock kind of bank early voting votes. So he came even stronger into Election Day. I also think this runoff, like Shaq just mentioned, Georgia voters are now used to it. They're ready for runoffs. Yes, they're over all the ads and the texts and the emails, but they were very engaged this runoff campaign. And then it came down to which candidate was able to rile up their base and connect with their base. And we saw that Warnock not only had a more consistent message where he really talked about competence and character, as Shaq mentioned, but Warnock had a clear runoff strategy where he was speaking to so many different segments, and that really paid off.
Talk about the difference here between Warnock and Brian Kemp. You know, Walker and Brian Kemp. The two did not engage with each other in the lead up to Election Day. Kemp came in late trying to help Walker get over the finish line. Do we think Kemp really believed that he could get Walker there? And if not, was campaigning with him, engaging with him just a way to say, look, I tried to do something here to help?
Yeah, I think if nothing else, Kemp needed to check that box because he is the leader of the Republican Party in Georgia. He wants to remain in the good graces of national Republican leaders. And I think he wants to keep his options open for his political future. So, he lent his campaign apparatus to the Walker campaign. He did do one public appearance, but he also helped raise funds and recorded some ads. So he checked all the boxes. I don't know, there's nothing that indicated they ever forged a real relationship. There's nothing that indicated that Kemp really was all in on Herschel Walker as a candidate, as an individual. Even his message when he campaigned for Herschel Walker was about that broader strategy of putting another Republican in the Senate as kind of a check on President Joe Biden.
Right. So if Kemp's hands are clean-ish, Mark Caputo, Donald Trump's are certainly not. And look, these 3 weeks for him have gone just about as badly as a campaign can go, right? He's had his personal controversies. He's now a political loser once again. What is Trump world thinking about their hand-picked candidate here going down in flames?
Yeah, well, it's another day ending in Y. This is a candidate who's made out of asbestos, so he catches fire frequently and yet doesn't burn. So, there's a conflagration in Trump world. How does that differ from any other day when he was president or when he was running for president, whether it was in 2020 or 2016? The campaign is built in such a way where they just accept Donald Trump is Donald Trump. Weird stuff is going to happen. And they need to basically have two campaigns, one where the candidate is going to do his thing and the other where the campaign is going to have to clean up around him and also just create a superstructure of actual competency where, for instance, they hire early state staff and they just make sure to hit their targets. Kind of related to the Georgia Senate runoff here, the Democrats smoked the Republicans in early voting. And Republicans are starting to wake up to the fact like, oh, my God, this is bad. And one of the reasons this is bad is because Donald Trump kind of told people don't vote by mail. Yeah. And early voting is kind of bad as well. And now you're even hearing voices on Fox like, oh, my God, this is a problem. Now that's kind of like the hot dog guy meme where it's like, oh, my God, who crashed my hot dog car?
Right.
Well, it's President Trump or former President Trump who did. But those conversations are now happening. Now, we don't want to overestimate what damage there is to Donald Trump because the reality is he's still running. He's still unopposed. You look at the polling. He's still on top in the Republican Party. How long is that polling going to hold like this? How long is that going to stay? I don't know. But right now, that's where it is.
But, Mark, you could argue that Georgia undermines kind of both of the things that makes Donald Trump the kind of post-presidency kingmaker that he wants to be, right? He couldn't crush his enemy, Brian Kemp, and he couldn't get his hand-picked candidate across the finish line. So if he can't do either of those things, what's the benefit of a Trump endorsement? What's anybody else in the party got to be afraid of?
Well, to kind of use the argument that folks in Trump world are saying is they're acknowledging Georgia's a problem, but they're kind of saying it's an isolated problem, right? Like that, like there's Georgia and then there's the rest of the nation. But the reality is in a few cases, Donald Trump got behind 3 Senate candidates who were pretty troubled and none so troubled as Herschel Walker. And in the end, though, this campaign did rest or fall or rise or fall on Herschel Walker's back. He had so much baggage, it was luggage. He got vastly outspent, in part because it was easier for Warnock to raise money from his base that liked him. It was harder for Walker because his base had a lot of questions about him.
If there's a path for a Republican to become president of the United States without winning Georgia, I'd be very interested to see the electoral map on there for them to call that a small problem. But that's a topic for another show, Mark. Ryan, take us inside what I imagine is a pretty good mood there on Capitol Hill for Senate Democrats today.
Yeah, you know, Garrett, the names that we don't often hear kind of in the postmortem of these elections are the members that run the campaign committees on the winning side, right? Everybody rushes to kind of pillar those who run the campaign committees on the side that loses, which is why you hear Rick Scott of Florida's name brought up over and over again. But a guy that a lot of people aren't talking about is Gary Peters from Michigan, who ran the Democratic Senate campaign arm. And I read a stat today that this was the most successful defense of a party in power in a midterm year that held the White House since 1934. So it really was a remarkable accomplishment for Democrats. And Gary Peters talked about it a little bit today, and he says his assessment of all of this, he seems to know exactly why he thinks Democrats won.
We knew we could win in a tough environment, but that was the bad news. It was a tough environment. The good news is it was clear the American people really don't like Republicans that much. I mean, that was clear in all of our research. They were saying they don't offer anything positive. They talk about the problems, but we all know the problems. You saw the ads during the campaign. Inflation's an issue. And the American public said, yeah, we know that. We go to the grocery store. We know it's an issue. Tell us what you're actually going to do about it. They never said what they would actually do about it.
And Gary, you know as well as anyone that Gary Peters is not very hyperbolic. He's not somebody that's going to send out a tweet that's going to go around the world. He's very methodical, and he and his team were very methodical throughout this entire process, never too high or never too low. They had a strategy. They implemented that strategy, and it clearly worked. And I think the name Gary Peters is one that we're going to hear a lot in the future, especially because he comes from a very important swing state. So not out of the realm of possibility that he could be a presidential candidate at some point down the road.
Wow, now we're minting multiple Democratic presidential aspirants on this show. Ryan, so what's the difference between 51 and 50, right? This moves the balance of power in the Senate ever so slightly to the left, does it not? I mean, now if you can, for people who are tired of hearing all of us in the political news talk about Joe Manchin, are we going to be talking about Joe Manchin a little bit less in the next Congress?
We should. You know, there's obviously two Democrats that caused Chuck Schumer heartburn, and that's Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, so they're not completely clear of it. But, Garrett, there's no doubt that this gives Schumer breathing room on a lot of fronts. Just from kind of a process standpoint, this gets them to a situation where they don't have to call Kamala Harris up to break a tie every single time there's a close margin. They're going to be in a much better position to push through a lot of judicial nominees from the Biden administration to rubber stamp his cabinet appointments. And then, you know, at a granular level, it is going to change the committee structure some. Right now, because of this 50-50 Senate, it is an even, amount of members in every single committee. Right. So that means it's a lot more difficult for them to do things like issue subpoenas and things along those lines. They'll now have clear majorities on all of those committees, so that's going to really change the scope of the way the Senate does business.
I feel like the combination of losing the House and expanding the majority in the Senate means a whole lot of time spent on judicial nominees in 2023. We'll have that to look forward to. Shaq, Tia, Mark, and Ryan, thank you all for your reporting and analysis. And coming up, it's all about the money. Lots and lots of money. A look at the massive piles of cash spent to flip just a handful of seats this midterm cycle, and more lessons from last night's runoff results. My panel is next. Plus, how a Supreme Court case brought by North Carolina Republicans could totally upend election laws as we know them. We'll have that story and key moments from today's arguments ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. $7.8 billion. It's not Aaron Judge's new contract. It's the amount of money that was spent on this last midterm election cycle on ads, just on ads alone. It's a gargantuan sum to be spent to basically flip one Senate seat and a handful of House seats. In fact, it's nearly double the amount spent in 2018 per ad impact. Joining me now to talk about the trench warfare that has become our politics, Eugene Daniels, White House correspondent for Politico and an NBC News political analyst, Jen Psaki, former Biden White House press secretary and an MSNBC host, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch and also an NBC News political analyst. So, Jen, I'll start with you. I mean, all that money and very little change. We've seen change elections, we've seen disruptive figures, but have we kind of gotten used to instability as stability in our political system, if that makes any sense?
Well, I mean, that number is so eye-popping. And then I was like, how much is Aaron Judge being paid?
Yeah.
That was like my next question. But I will say this all sort of changed in 2010 with the overturning of the Citizens United ruling, right? Because the vast majority of this spending across the country is by outside groups. And those are eye-popping numbers these groups are spending in states. The challenge is that nothing is going to change because both sides are going to want to have the same rules.
Right.
So it's going to be a continued race to raise more money, to spend more money, including in states like Georgia.
And one of the things that I've talked to both Republicans and Democrats about, when you talk about Citizens United, they are both looking at the landscape as like, this actually wasn't good, even Republicans. I was talking to one a couple of weeks ago, and they said it has allowed, in his words, the crazies to take over the Republican Party because it defangs the parties, right? It defangs the actual party apparatus. Yeah. And so it's not just bad kind of because we're spending $7 billion in a year, but also because the parties have less control over who is able to rise to the top.
We're going to talk about this state legislature case here in a little bit, the Supreme Court case, but the combination of gerrymandering in the maps and Citizens United, are we, I guess, Stephen, are we locked into very narrow majorities in both chambers for good? Are there swingable movement left in the system as we have it right now?
I think there is, but it will require us breaking out of the stasis of this primary system that we're seeing. And one of the other things, and I think it's the under-discussed aspect of Citizens United and the aftermath, is the change from big dollar donors to small dollar donors. Particularly true in the Republican Party, where I think it's distorted the debate, because you have all of these candidates, national candidates sometimes in House races, Senate races, trying to raise money in $5, $10, $15 increments. We probably would have thought that was a good thing if people had told us this at the outset. Instead, what it means is the most sort of hysterical, red meat, crazy appeals to people to raise that money. And it's distorted the debate. And yet Raphael Warnock, a likable candidate, had no problem raising gobs of money from small dollar donors. Herschel Walker, who has to lean on the bigger dollar donors, struggles here. If likability is lesson one, what's lesson two for kind of candidate selection and how you put together a Senate race like that we saw from Georgia last night?
I mean, I think the good news is competence and running on an actual platform and policies. And, there are good debates to be had between what different people in different parties believe in, about education or economic reform or things like that. Raphael Warnock ran on an agenda. Right. He ran a lot on the Biden agenda. Herschel Walker ran on, I don't know. I mean, he ran on werewolves, he ran on extremism, and that is a lesson too. You need to be running on a platform of something.
Stephen, if the writing wasn't on the wall about Donald Trump's effect on the Republican Party, particularly even just on this issue of recruitment, it has to be now. I mean, you heard the list of horribles of everything that has gone on in the first 22 days of his campaign. If Republicans can't look at this midterm cycle and say he was neither kingmaker or effectively able to dispatch his enemies, if not now for quitting him, when? Yeah, I mean, this is not the first time we've asked that question, right? We've had this conversation before.
A cat with 9 lives.
Right. Yeah. So I actually think I think we're there. I think this is an appropriate time to ask that question. I talked to a Republican, currently serving Republican House member this morning, who said the only people who are still afraid of Donald Trump are currently serving Republicans. Interesting. And even they're, sort of tiptoeing out a little bit further with their criticism, I think, because he imperils their political future, right? I mean, tie your campaign, your arguments to Donald Trump, and that's not a winning way to run. And I think, the Herschel Walker's a good case in point in this instance. I think there's plenty to run against on Joe Biden's agenda. He didn't do it. Right.
Well, that's sort of my point. Right?
Yeah, no, I know.
You can run on policy debates, right? And that's fine. People have different views on that. He did not run on that. He didn't run on Trump's agenda. He didn't run on anyone's agenda.
Well, Trump doesn't really have thoughtful critiques of Joe Biden. I do, but Donald Trump doesn't.
So looking ahead then, Eugene, if Donald Trump is the toxic X here that the Republicans can't quite break up with, let me extend this metaphor a bit further. Does it take somebody new coming on the scene for them to be able to finally put him behind them? How do you see this ending?
Yeah, they need the new boy or gal that will come through and get their eyes. And I think more importantly, they need someone who is going to take it to Donald Trump. We've talked about this over and over. We talked about this in 2016. The folks that are thinking about running what they have to do, Republicans believe, their strategists I know that you've been talking to too, are saying they have to go at him, and that's that. And because he, they call him a bully, and they say the best thing to do with the bully is go right at them and hit them first. And I think Republicans have not done that. It's unclear how they're going to do that, especially when they spent years and years kind of following Donald Trump. And you talk about DeSantis, which is the name we keep talking about, the governor of Florida, and he's in Trump's image, right? So how do you go against Donald Trump when you are also someone who is Trumpy? So it's going to take a Mike Pence. It is going to take, the myriad of people that have said that they're thinking about running to do that. And I will say, one of the things I was talking to someone maybe 2 days ago about Republicans doing this, and they said what you're hearing is they are coming out against Donald Trump on some things, but at the same time they're saying they would vote for him if he was the nominee.
Right. I mean, I've been doing that reporting on Capitol Hill. They won't go that far. Right. Jen, Democrats also took advantage of a structural imbalance here that started with Joe Biden in 2020, which is voting by mail and voting early. Donald Trump has lambasted it, and last night, Ronna McDaniel had to come out and say, maybe not so fast. I want to play what she had to say last night about this.
What we do need is our voters need to vote early. I have said this over and over again. There were many in 2020 saying don't vote by mail, don't vote early, and we have to stop that and understand that if Democrats are getting ballots in for a month, we can't expect to get it all done in one day. Right. You wouldn't feed your family in a one day of harvesting. We've got to be doing the whole month like they are.
Are Republicans finally going to untie their other arm from behind their back here after last night as well?
It is a strategically insane thing that they did this cycle, right? I mean, the thing about voting by mail, early voting, is that your party, your candidate, then banks those votes. You don't have to go after those voters on Election Day. So if you're the Warnock campaign, you got as many people to early vote as possible. And then what they were able to do is go after people on Election Day in some of these red rural counties that are more Republican, but they got them out to vote, to run up the vote in the Atlanta metro area. So, yes, she said that. We'll see if that plays out other places. But, yes, this is something. And I will also say, in Georgia, there are laws that made it more difficult to vote, right? I mean, these laws cut the number of days to early vote. It cut resources to local county officials. So despite that, the Democrats still turn people out. But, yes, they're disadvantaging themselves for sure.
So a moment ago, we just missed it, but Mitt Romney was at the Sticks describing Donald Trump as the kiss of death for the Republican Party. The colorful metaphors continue. Eugene, there's also some star-making that has happened in Georgia in this last cycle. Talk to me about Raphael Warnock's political future in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've talked about a lot is how Herschel Walker was a bad candidate, that he didn't have an agenda, all of these things. But it also is possible, and I think very true, that Raphael Warnock has run good campaigns. The man has run for this seat 4 times and been voted at this 4 times for 2 years. And I think he is someone who Democrats are talking about as a future Democratic presidential nominee, a vice presidential nominee, if that is the case. And I think, he is a preacher, and that is something that, Democrats have kind of ceded religion for a very long time to Republicans. And he's someone who can pull some of those folks back, because when I was on the road, when I was in Georgia, talking to voters, they said the fact that he was a preacher, even if they didn't agree with him on policy, gave them a sense that he was a decent person who would listen to them. And that is something that voters need.
That's huge. And I imagine the very Catholic Joe Biden would disagree with that statement about ceding religion. But we'll leave that here for now. We didn't get to talk about Brian Kemp as the potential Republican star coming out of Georgia, but that's why we do this show every day. We'll have to do it again. Jen, Steve, and Eugene, thank you all for your analysis here. And you can check out Meet the Press blog for even more analysis on the lessons from Georgia and the massive midterm ad spending there and nationwide. Head to meetthepress.com. Up next, I'll talk to Michigan's Secretary of State as battlegrounds like hers brace for a Supreme Court decision that could potentially have major consequences for elections across America. That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back. With the 2022 midterms now in the books, the Supreme Court heard arguments today in a case that could have major implications on the 2024 election. The case, Moore versus Harper, focuses on North Carolina Republicans' effort to draw congressional districts in that state, but it could ultimately decide whether state legislatures have the authority to set rules for federal elections without oversight from state courts at all. The case hinges on what's known as independent state legislature theory, which was embraced by Donald Trump during the 2020 election. Critics, though, say it would allow partisan legislatures to undermine the integrity of elections. One of those critics, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, spoke at the rally at the court earlier today.
You could have state legislatures all over the country, not just being able to do gerrymandered maps, but make all kinds of decisions on elections and maybe even other things without any court review. And one of the questions raised by the justices was, wait a minute, well, what about governor's vetoes? Are they also don't count? Can state legislatures just do everything they want, and can they create slates of electors and the like? So that's why this argument is so important.
Here to explain the case a little further, NBC News' Julia Ainsley. So, Julia, walk us through this idea even. What is independent state legislature theory, and why is it so central to this case?
Well, I've been learning all about it today, Garrett, from outside the Supreme Court and hearing from people who are strong proponents of it. They believe that the elections clause, the federal elections clause, does give the legislatures the legitimate power to make these determinations. In fact, the word legislature is in that clause, but traditionally we've allowed other bodies within states, like courts and like governors, to put a check on legislative power when it comes to voting rules, how districts are mapped, voter ID laws, mail-in ballots, all of that. There has been checks and balances on that process. So people here are now, who are opposing this, are now afraid that basically if this goes through, the winners get to make the rules, and that it would be so hard to unseat one party from power, no matter the party, in any state's legislature, because as soon as they're elected, they could just change the rules. They could make more districts for themselves so that they could keep the majority. That's the fear here, and that's why you saw such a polarizing opinion between the justices today.
Yeah, can you
heard from
Yeah, I was going to ask you to jump into that a little bit further. I mean, it's always difficult to parse what the justices are thinking just based on their questions, but did you get any sense of anybody tipping their hand here about which way they're leaning on this case?
Well, we knew that it was really only up to about 2 or 3 justices that were going to change their opinion or be swayed in any way. Justice Alito led a dissent on this case earlier when they put a temporary hold on North Carolina from being able to redraw those districting maps right before the 2022 election. And we knew that Justices Gorsuch and Thomas agreed with Alito on that they do think that legislators should have this power. Meanwhile, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor saying that they thought that this could be really the unhinging of the democratic process, are very worried about what the implications of this could be. Instead, I was really paying attention to Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh, who had a lot of questions about whether or not the way the clause was written really gave unchecked power to legislatures. Of course, they tend to ask more questions about how this could be used in the past rather than the implications that you or I or other voters might always care about. So right now, it doesn't seem to be very clear. Both sides came out of the Supreme Court today thinking they had the victory, but we really won't know until probably about mid-June, Garrett. But the stakes really couldn't be higher. A lot of people are watching this very closely. This is something that began as kind of a fringe political theory and is really gaining traction now in conservative legal circles, who say that it should be up to these legislators to make these rules.
All right, Julia Ainsley, thank you for your reporting. And joining me now is Jocelyn Benson, Michigan's Secretary of State, who signed an amicus brief opposing North Carolina, the Republicans, in this case. So you also observed the arguments today. I saw you nodding along to some of Julia's reporting. I mean, what was your take, particularly on those swing 3, if they are them, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and maybe Justice Roberts, too?
I think they very much were showing themselves to be listening and open to all the different decisions and maybe looking for a narrow path where they could, reject the Supreme Court's work in North Carolina or decision, but still not completely reject or upend decades, centuries of checks and balances in every state that enable us to run fair elections through the balance of power that has been long established and has worked for many years.
Roberts is sort of famous for wanting to find a middle path on these kinds of things, the narrowest possible ruling. Is there a Goldilocks option for the court here if they want to back up North Carolina but not totally gut the way we run elections in this country?
That was really what a lot of the discussion I observed was. And it was very, very long oral arguments, but it was one in which justices were trying to find a middle ground or find some way to not completely remove the important checks that not just a state Supreme Court, but a state election official and executive officer has to bear on ensuring democracy works for everyone, and also recognizing the power of a state constitution and how the independent state legislature doctrine really could eliminate or completely abrogate the state constitution's power to, through interpretation by the court, really check a otherwise unbridled authority of a political actor like the state legislature.
And Alito and the proponents of this theory argue, I mean, you take North Carolina, where this is based, is pretty close to a 50-50 state. I mean, it's always a very competitive state. The original Republican map, there would have been something like 10 Republicans, 4 Democrats. Are Alito and company basically saying, like, yeah, if you could draw that map, go nuts, that's fair?
It's a question of who should draw the maps. I mean, in Michigan, we have an independent commission, a citizens commission that was put into our state constitution and could potentially be upended by this case if it goes very broadly. And it's quite ironic because we've seen the best way to get to fair maps is to put citizens in charge of our districts. That's what we've seen in Michigan and California and other states. And so to really endorse not just this theory that has no grounding really in the Constitution, giving state legislatures unbridled, unchecked authority over redistricting, would also open the door for intense gerrymandering by really some of the most political actors in our states.
I want to play for you some of what North Carolina's Democratic governor said about this case today and get your reaction on the other side. Here's Roy Cooper on MSNBC earlier today.
You know, taking it to the place where I think many of them would want to go, and if you look at Donald Trump's plan, being able to ignore the popular vote in a state and change presidential electors. Depending on what the U.S. Supreme Court does here, it could give state legislatures unfettered authority to set the rules for federal elections, and it could affect the presidential election. And not just with electors, but with the rules of how you operate the voting, restricting the vote for certain populations.
So obviously that's a pretty dire warning, and this goes far beyond drawing congressional maps. Is that warning overblown?
Well, I think the interesting thing I saw about the oral arguments today was the suggestion that even if this case gets decided on narrower grounds that just focus on redistricting, it could open the door for a future case next term or a subsequent term that does take this further and does approach some of the more dire consequences that the governor was talking about and that Justice Kagan talked about and raised with the petitioners and respondents today. So, you know, whatever direction, whether it's a broad or narrow determination that the court makes in this case, we could very easily go down a road of giving these political actors too much authority when it needs to be a balance, checks and balances in our states.
And we were talking about this before we came on the air with Michigan's independent commission here. If the court rules against, the Democratic argument here, does the Michigan system just get thrown out and go back to zero? It's hard for me to imagine how it's a small c conservative argument to say, we appreciate what you've done in Michigan in setting up your own system, but actually we're going to tell you can't even do that.
Yeah, because it came from citizens amending the state constitution to create an independent citizen redistricting commission. And so if the Supreme Court were to go as far as to completely say that the state's constitution has nothing to say that could curb the state legislature's authority around elections, then it does call into question citizen-led amendments to state constitutions like ours that actually did create independent redistricting that's citizen-led for and nonpartisan for the lawmakers in our state. So it's dire consequences indeed. My hope and my read on the case today is that it may not go that far, but it could very easily be an opinion that opens the door for future very dire opinions in subsequent terms.
And I appreciate anyone who can read oral arguments and tell me which way the wind is going to blow.
I used to be the dean of a law school, so.
Well, there you go. Far more qualified than I. All right, Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State for Michigan, thank you very much for making the time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and coming up after the break, the rise and reach of far-right extremism. New details out of Germany, where officials arrested dozens of suspects this morning for allegedly plotting a violent coup. What we know next. But first, we're excited to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with clips and highlights from the best archive in all of news. On November 12th, 1989, 2 days after the Berlin Wall fell, Meet the Press was broadcast from Brandenburg Gate. Here's the former Chancellor of West Germany talking about that historic moment.
We have witnessed these dramatic events on the dividing line between East Germany, West Germany, East Berlin, West Berlin. As we watch what's happening here, do you see it as the historic change which could remake the face of Europe?
Well, let me first say that it's the first time that Germans established their freedom by a revolution, even by a very peaceful revolution. You could really say that Europe is changing, and it will certainly deserve also and necessitate also a change in the attitudes of the West, Western Europe as well as the United States.
Welcome back. A potential coup attempt was dramatically thwarted in Germany this morning, according to German officials, as police arrested 25 people suspected of plotting to violently overthrow the government. The suspects from the group are affiliated with a German far-right movement that questions the legitimacy of the modern German state. Let's go down to Berlin, where Sky News' Siobhan Robbins has more on this story.
Yes, a huge operation and a huge anti-terror operation as well. 3,000 officers involved in these raids, searches of more than 150 scenes as they arrested these 25 people. Now, we understand the group that is accused of plotting to violently overthrow the German government in this coup was basically planning for what was called a Day X, where they go in and take control of the government. Some of those involved in this plotting, it's claimed, were conspiracy theorists believing theories from groups like QAnon, believing that the deep state was controlling Germany and it needed to be overthrown. So those some of the motives that are alleged behind these plans. Now, we know that some of those who have been detained include a judge, an acting soldier as well, and a 71-year-old aristocrat. Now, it's understood that that man was seen as a leader in this conspiracy, and that he was actually being lined up to be the new leader of this new state of Germany. And it's alleged that he'd been talking to, or trying to talk to, Russian officials to talk about how they would set up this new state once they overthrew the government. Now, the Kremlin has denied any involvement in this, but this is a huge operation. As I said, 3,000 officers involved, and arrests here in Germany, but also in Austria and in Italy.
All right, thank you, Siobhan, for that reporting. And we should note that extremists and far-right groups have been on the rise worldwide. It's a topic that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz discussed when he sat down with Chuck in September.
Hungary, Sweden, Italy all have had rising far-right. We're going to have far-right leaders, it looks like, in all three of those countries. How concerned are you about this rise of far-right populism inside of the EU?
I think we see populism in many places in the world, right populism, if I may say it, in the United States.
Yes, you're not wrong.
And
I don't know who's more contagious.
And we have to understand that this is something we have to go against.
Now to some major developments out of China, as the country has announced it's scrapping some of its strictest COVID restrictions following a wave of protests across the country. This represents a major shift away from the government's zero COVID strategy. The country's National Health Commission saying that for the first time ever, people with mild cases of COVID can now isolate at home instead of going to a centralized quarantine facility. They also scrapped some testing requirements required for some public spaces. These changes come after protests in cities across the country, which ignited a rare show of widespread public unrest against authorities in China, something the country's communist government hasn't seen in decades. The concern now shifts to whether the government is ready for a potential exit wave, if you will, as it loosens restrictions, given the country's comparatively low levels of immunity to the virus. Now, still to come, protesters up the pressure on Iran's regime with nationwide strikes as the future of women's rights and freedom remains uncertain. And don't miss today's episode of the Chuck Toddcast, which delves into growing security concerns over TikTok. Chuck talks with Emily Baker-White, technology reporter at Forbes, and Kaya Urif from The Information. It's available right now wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The status of Iran's morality police remains uncertain after state media reported that the country's attorney general said the police force tasked with enforcing the country's strict dress code has been abolished. But even as questions swirl about the status of the controversial morality police, Iran's supreme leader is calling for the, quote, revolutionary reconstruction of the country's cultural system. Meanwhile, activists in Iran continue to call for nationwide strikes and the closure of businesses and shops across Iran in hopes of ramping up the pressure on the regime. I'm joined now by Hadi Ghaemi, Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. And let me just start there. I mean, what do you think the Supreme Leader means when he says he wants to reconstruct Iran's cultural system?
Well, he was meeting with the so-called National Supreme Council for Cultural Affairs, and he actually used the opportunity to complain to them that he felt isolated. Implicitly, he said that he's not getting enough support from main personalities in the regime. And he again used a very vague term of basically referring to cultural revolution, which means subjugation of every institution in the society, particularly higher education. When they mention cultural revolution, they mean taking over universities and rehauling the way academia is run.
What do you make of the comments from the Attorney General there about abolishing the morality police? Should we take them at face value, or do we think there might be something else motivating that?
It really, to me, it didn't make any sense to make that announcement because de facto on the ground, the morality police has been disbanded. Iranian people disbanded it on September 16 when they took on the streets. We have not seen them on the street, but instead we're seeing every form of militia and armed men who are killing and maiming people. They don't need morality police at the moment. So functionally, it was irrelevant. Legally, it was not significant because they made it clear the law hasn't changed and they're going to look into other ways, even potentially using technology for facial recognition to enforce the law. And politically, it was too little, too late to be interpreted as anything in terms of concession to the protesters. I think they have moved way beyond that, and this was not going to change anyone's mind.
No, you can't disband a police force that's been functionally non-existent. So talk to me about this strike. It's a very different kind of pressure being applied from the protests we've seen over the last couple of weeks. How does this strike, these businesses, stores, other kind of cultural institutions locking up their doors, what kind of pressure does that put on the regime?
Well, this is the second time it is happening in a month where we have a 3-day period where you get widespread shuttering of businesses. First and foremost, it's symbolic. It's very important. Basically, the small business class is telling the government that it's taking the side of the protesters, and an indication of potentially economically crippling the country. This, of course, needs to become much more widespread and become part of the labor movement in major industries, especially petrochemical industry and oil industry, if it goes that way. But the fact that it keeps happening and it has really widespread support among small businessmen and shop owners, it is a significant message to the regime that it really has lost its legitimacy in a broad sector of society.
Right. It certainly shows a different type of citizen kind of finding different ways to get engaged. I remember very vividly the protests in 2009 and the images coming out of Iran at that time. I wonder how you feel these protests that we're seeing now are different from that moment.
Well, it's very different. Last time we were primarily happening in Tehran and a few other large cities. They did have a political leadership, a very clear political grievance in terms of election results. This time, what is really impressive is how spontaneous and leaderless it is, and how it shows that there have been many, many currents under the surface of Iranian society ready to literally, like a volcano, erupt. And we're seeing that eruption. So it is very different than 2009.
So we've been analyzing Iranian politics, but let's talk about U.S. politics in relation to this now. Do you think the U.S. government fully understands how significant this moment is potentially, and what, if anything, differently do you think the U.S. government should be doing to take advantage of it on behalf of the Iranian people and in furtherance of a better relationship with the people there, if not the leadership of that country?
I think the Biden administration is slowly coming around to understanding the significance of this historical moment. It took it time, and it still does not have a clear strategy ahead because it had put all its eggs in the nuclear deal basket, which pretty much is dead. And they are trying to walk a fine line. They are trying to support the protesters, but not shut down the road to diplomacy on the nuclear deal. But they need to understand that the nuclear deal, the way it was, just doesn't make any more sense. They have to make a clear distinction between the arms control side of it and the economic benefits of it. There is no way under these circumstances that the U.S. government should be opening a big channel of financial resources for this government, which we will know will use to kill and apply more violence inside the country. The administration really is in a tricky situation if it follows that.
Hadi Ghaemi, you took the last question right out of my mouth. I appreciate your time and your expertise on this issue. Thank you for joining us. And thank you at home for being with us for this hour. Chuck will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.